quickly.
Thank you very much. Now we'll hear from Ms. Sukumar.
So thank you very much for this opportunity. I come here not just as an executive director of MCIS, a nonprofit social enterprise in Toronto, but also representing the collective voice of a number of different organizations that we serve and that we connect with. We have a unique vantage point because we serve a multilingual population, so communities that want to access critical information to services. Now, who is MCIS? So what I will be presenting is sort of a boots on the ground perspective from our own experience growing a social enterprise. Now, MCIS is a nonprofit. As I said, we are located in Toronto. We have 70 staff, 6,000 interpreters and translators across Canada. We serve over 800 organizations in the broader public sector and provide language services, interpretation, translation, training programs, and so on in over 300 languages and dialects. So we represent sort of the cross-section of this country. What's unique about us is less than 10% of our overall revenue and our projected revenue for the 2019-2020 fiscal year is $12 million. Less than 10% is from grants. So all of the revenue that we earn right now is earned revenue. And we got here with great difficulty. We faced a number of challenges, and so we want to share some of that experience with you. Now, while talking about experience, I want to focus on three key topics as it pertains to innovation in the not-for-profit sector. The first is talk about the conditions that are necessary to support innovation, research, and development. Secondly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Cra regulations, which stand in the way of nonprofit innovation. And then thirdly, I'd like to talk about the role of nonprofits in policy, public policy innovation. So in terms of the definition, it's really important that we define social innovation not just as disruptive, bringing about disruptive change, but also incremental change. So in our case, for example, in 2006, we were fully funded and we wanted to get out of this funding cycle, and the board said go out and start earning revenue. But our conundrum was we didn't have capacity to go out and earn revenue. So how do you build capacity when you don't earn revenue? And that's when, we had to come up with a number of patchwork solutions. One of them was partnering with the Rotman School of Business, hiring MBA interns, getting them to help us design our operations and so on. And we went after some project funding and so on. So the situation we find, the path, it was long and painful. It took us 10 years to get to a point of self-sufficiency. And even at this point, when we want to innovate, we have barriers that we face. But what I want to talk about basically is that the situation is not very different for most organizations, as we've heard. And we find that most of them want to innovate, but they don't know how. They don't know how to scale, how to diversify, how to get out of the dependence on government funding. And based on our own experiences and consultations, we suggest that we need a dedicated sort of innovation role in organizations. We need nonprofits to have money to innovate. We would like this innovation role to shape the organizational culture, introduce sort of design and system thinking, technology literacy, and so forth. So we've made a number of recommendations in this regard. The second condition that we believe is needed for innovation is the following of an emergent sort of social innovation strategy. So at the moment, the way things are is that you go after funding, and most government funding bodies, they give funding to organizations in a very siloed manner. So organizations often are pitted against each other, and there's a lot of duplication and wasteful spending. We believe that if there was a digital platform where we could identify all the programs that are being funded in the not-for-profit sector, we could identify duplication as well as the gaps in services. And this emergent model will mean that a number of different players, that is funders, private sector, public sector, academia, and community members will come together in collectively solving their problems, and they will do it as they learn. So issues will be tested as people are learning. So the second issue that I want to talk about is CRA regulations. So 4 years ago, we reached a point of self-sufficiency, and at this point, we started to earn a surplus. Now the government, my board was really concerned because we were now accumulating revenue, and we needed this surplus in order to invest in our technology projects and so on. But we were not at all clear about how CRA looked upon this whole issue. And so we went out and got a legal opinion, and then we had to create a framework whereby we justified all of our investments and tied it back to our vision and mission. What we are recommending is that the Income Tax Act be based not on an homogenized view of nonprofits, which it is right now, but it actually be much more specific in addressing the range of nonprofits that exist in the sector regarding what is permissible and what's not for the nonprofit, for an agency to qualify as a nonprofit. And finally, I just want to say that nonprofits should have a role in public policy innovation. We are, after all, in close contact with our communities. So last week or last month, we had what was called a language policy hackathon. We engaged with members of the community that face language barriers, and we found the experience to be extremely rewarding. We find that if you have inclusion, then you end up having diversity, and then diversity leads to greater innovation. So we want all levels of government to create deliberate opportunities for nonprofits to manage and lead public policy. So in conclusion, the best way to support nonprofit innovation is to commit to innovation in a very broad sense, to remove financial barriers with dedicated innovation, a budget for innovation staff, budget for research and development, and for collaboration among multiple stakeholders. You have to commit to digital platforms so you have this information available, centralized, so everyone has access, and there is greater transparency in terms of the work that's being done by the not-for-profit sector. So thank you very much for this opportunity to contribute.
Well, thank you as well. As you can see, we have another witness who's popped up on the screen who we've been trying to reach. Is Mr. Vincent Van Chandel, le président du réseau québécois en innovation sociale.
He's the president of the Réseau québécois en innovation sociale. Welcome, sir.
Mr. Van Chandel, and then we'll go to questions. Monsieur Chandel, s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour.
I'm sorry, I must apologize. We had some technical difficulties on this end. But I do want to thank you for your invitation very briefly. I would like to give you some background about what we do and make a couple of suggestions that could be useful in the discussion. First of all, with respect to context, there are thousands of nonprofit organizations that exist in Canada, not just in Quebec, where I am, but elsewhere. And the majority of them are constituted on a voluntary basis, where they are groups of people who try to solve problems that exist for certain other groups of people in a variety of regions, neighborhoods, sectors. And these organizations have developed a capacity to innovate, to find solutions in the area of culture, in the area of the environment or community work. This is done to try to mitigate poverty and inequality, but also to strengthen the capability that a community possesses. Second, there is a great deal of funding that is available, and that is throughout Canada. Millions, hundreds of millions are distributed. Organizations count on these monies to be able to provide social innovation. If there were to be some changes made to legislation, perhaps it could be that something could be done to help the organizations increase their activity. I do have some suggestions, though. First of all, the criterion of mitigating poverty is, as far as I'm concerned, and others in Quebec, should be broadened to include the possibility of strengthening capabilities to support communities to take themselves in hand and to take over their own management of their communities. Secondly, there is the matter of understanding the funding of education. There is a transfer of experience and a need to support that transfer of experience, which is part of the entire educational dimension. I'm throwing out these ideas for the purpose of debate, for conversation. We want to be able to generate revenue, and we also want to see that the foundations are entitled to invest, not just depend on subsidies, but to have institutional related investment. That investment has to be part of what is recognized as a voluntarism. And Canada should reflect that because beyond the 3.5% of the revenue that is distributed, really the rest is used in areas that perhaps have no attachment to the legislation that exists. And finally, without getting into details, we want to have a direct mechanism between the public powers and the public institutions and this sector. Ultimately, what we are looking at is in the charity sector is adequate of funding to support voluntarism and the charitable sector to help it reach innovative solutions for itself and for themselves. One last thought. Income tax credits could be refundable. At present, they are non-refundable. And I believe that that could provide for greater tax equity amongst people who also contribute to the funding of these organizations through donations. Thank you. Well, thank you, sir.
From Senators. Senator Amdavar.
Thank you, Chair. You're really all remarkable in your capacity to innovate and generate new solutions to new and old problems. I'm going to make a comment about social innovation and ask you all, because you're all social innovators, to respond to it. And I believe that social innovation thrives best when organizations, individuals, leaders, communities are free to take risk, fail, and learn from failure. But we live in a risk-averse society. When I think about the kinds of things that occupy us on Parliament Hill, it sort of gives further foundation to my observation that governments don't take kindly to risk. So I wonder what comfort, what risk mitigation strategies you can talk about such that public servants and their ministers embrace risk in the way each one of you has and succeeded. How do you persuade us to embrace risk and fail if necessary?
Well,
anyone?
I'll take that one. I don't like failing. I really, really dislike failing. When I fail, the results are dramatic for my staff, and so we do spend a great deal of time considering, reconsidering, drafting, and redrafting the programs that we propose. And we repropose them a number of times to a number of different funders until it sticks. We have a very tenacious group of people, and that's how we get our innovative programming out there. Sometimes it's not a federal, municipal, or provincial grantor that will give us the money. Sometimes it's foundational support, or it's organizations like United Way who don't have the same, don't have this, work with a different set of rules than the public service does. But things that can ameliorate, as I mentioned before, is really creating a separate section that is looking at particular problems that they want to solve, and they're looking for particular types of programming, or they want to explore programming that might help. Developing personal relationships is really key. In order to create a complex solution, you can't put out a CFP and say, okay, well, I'll get a bunch of different answers and one will be the right one. It's important to find organizations that have proven themselves to be innovative and have dialogues with them and co-develop solutions with them. Knowing what the organizational needs are and working to support that organization as they develop, committing to a multi-year program and develop a promulgation program afterwards. Supporting intersectional solutions. So it may not be one organization. My organization might say these other 4 organizations need to participate in this because the problem is more complex, or the outcomes could be much greater. If we work together, we can serve more people from different communities. Having an active championship at a fairly high level, ADM level or above, that's something that, from my experience, causes public servants to relax a little bit. And it's difficult with public works to change how the business managers look at money, but if there can be new ways of exploring how to examine financial risk with this sort of exploratory process, that would be a good way, so that it doesn't feel like everything is a failure if money's spent in the wrong category, or if brochures aren't handed out, then it's a failure.
Other comments?
In our case, I think we've fostered an organizational culture, which is a startup culture. So everybody is right on board, willing to try things out without having thought it through to the nth degree. So we don't experience the risk, I think, as, subjectively as others would, who would have considered all the possible consequences. The other thing is we try to have contingencies in place whereby we have fallbacks. And we also try to be very nimble, flexible, and adaptable. So if something doesn't work, we try to preempt. We do damage control. So we do have a good risk radar, try to be as preemptive as possible. But if it comes down to corrective action, we're also nimble and try to act quickly. So we don't, overthink everything to the nth degree. I think that's part of the culture.
Thank you for those responses. My question was not how you deal with risk.
Right.
My question was, how can you help
Okay.
government deal with risk?
And I think that's part of the, I kind of answered that in a long-winded way. I think we study things to the nth degree, and sometimes we just have to try different solutions.
Mr. Van Schachtel, you have a response? Oui?
Oui,
Yes, thank you. First of all, I think it's an excellent question. I'll attempt an answer. It's a paradox because oftentimes organizations that work on the ground in urgent situations can't risk making a mistake, and they hope that they will have the support of governments. And in Canada, we have a very competent public service. And it's not an individual problem. It's not that people are fearful, but they're caught up in rules and regulations that lead them to reach certain decisions or choose certain behaviors. And my predecessors, the people who've spoken already, talked about doing things differently. We have to change some rules and work together. That is the principle of co-building in the public service. There should be discussions with various levels of officials in the context of various networks of the realities that are experienced, of the rules that apply. There should be discussion on the assessment or evaluation tools as well. You have to seek to measure the impact of actions taken. That is critical. Might we agree on evaluation criteria that might be acceptable by governments and by the officials who would be applying the governmental rules, apply them in accordance with the wishes of the people working on the ground? There should be funds. This is a proposal we've often seen in Quebec, but it has yet to be applied. The idea being that in some departments, a portion of its budget might be set aside for innovation initiatives that are outside of the box in order to change the ways of doing things, not to destroy everything, but rather to improve upon what's there and work together in the implementation and assessment of these measures and tools. I hope I wasn't speaking too quickly for the interpreter. Thank you very much.
One more.
Ms. Sukumar, in your presentation, which is excellent, thank you so much, you say that the Income Tax Act is based on a homogenized view of not-for-profits. We tend to agree with you. I do. We've also heard proposals here that Canada would be better served if we parsed out not-for-profits in terms of member benefit and private benefit. Is that would that be a correct way of identifying what you mean by, not painting everyone with the same brush, but different strokes for different folks?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
I think the distinction between member and public benefit is the most obvious one, but also in the interpretation bulletins, the way they have said that you can operate exclusively as for not-for-profit purpose, but your focus, it's just that the wording is very confusing and it doesn't say where to draw the line as to where you can earn surplus or accumulate surplus. For example, if I have a big technology project that's going to cost me $500,000, I have to accumulate surplus year over year to save money for that. And yet, if I look at the interpretation bulletin, I can't understand clearly if I can do that or not.
Not-for-profits can't have a surplus.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Fukunaga, I have a question for you, and I'm trying to understand. I think I heard you say you're a not-for-profit and that you are not yet a charity and you can't issue charitable receipts and therefore you can't access charitable donations. So why don't you apply for charitable status? What's holding you back?
The amount of regulations around the financial requirements for being a charity around like audits and keeping records are a huge challenge for an organization our size. Like, if we have to put 15% of our budget towards just accountant fees, that's 15% that we can't put towards helping people and things like that. So we've maintained our not-for-profit status currently to allow for some flexibility in our mission statement and in our growth strategy so that we can have something that is concrete and developed and is sustainable, because the last thing we want to be doing is not helping as many people rather than trying to make sure we are meeting the financial requirements of maintaining our charitable status.
Thank you.
Senator Slobodko Benson, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. So I have a bit of a preamble and a question for Mr. Lau. One of the things that I have found in my past life when I was working in the not-for-profit sector is innovation is often killed by pedantic checklists that people use to adjudicate proposals. And so no matter how innovative, or to your detriment of being innovative in your proposal and really thinking outside of the box to answer a very complex social issue going on in our community, the innovation is kind of killed by this checklist that the proposal reviewers have to use to check. And one of my small experiences was having a proposal rejected because we didn't cut and paste their outcomes into our proposal, and so therefore didn't qualify for money. So has this been your experience at all around getting money for, especially around complex social problems that are happening?
What I said a bit earlier about that supporting social innovation needs to be its own process is probably my answer to that. If you use the same staff that work on sort of the regular meat and potatoes calls for proposals, and they're using a particular methodology, which is very structured and very good when you need to look at a wide range of proposals to see which proponent has the best looking chance at fulfilling those services with a very small departmental budget, that's very good for that type of process. It's really not very good when you're looking at gaps that they haven't addressed in their CFP, or you're looking at creating an intersectional solution. Then everything starts to go wiggly, and that's why I mentioned sometimes we need to disguise a pineapple to look like a potato.
Right.
It is really important that if social innovation in programming is to be supported, that it really needs to be. I think departments probably need to help identify what they want to solve, and then bring it to another sort of executive level, and have that financed separately, and have collaboration between whatever organization that could be and the department and the groups that are creating the programming, and just watch what happens, see what direction it goes. Sometimes you get really unexpected results. And about 4 years ago, my organization started a gardening project. The basic idea was to partner newcomers with seniors, and it solved a whole bunch of different issues, but it was a very oblique way of providing a service. It looked like a garden. And so when we said, well, what are the people getting? Well, they're getting fresh vegetables, but they're learning language at a very, very peaceful way. They're developing multi-generational relationships after they've lost all their neighbors and friends and family, aunts and uncles. Seniors are getting visits. Everyone's getting activity, and they happen to get some fresh vegetables. So there's so many different types of positive things that are happening in the 60 gardens that we created in little tiny Greater Victoria, that if I say, well, this is an ESL program, well, it's not. If I say it's this, it's not. It's just so many different things. And the type of social inclusion we're creating with that programming, it's difficult to express to one particular department. And that's why the Victoria Foundation said, here's a bunch of money, make it happen. And then when it was successful, the federal government said, oh, that looks like a good program. Last year, the federal minister for seniors came and visited one of our gardens, and it was lovely. But for us to get to that point, we had to take a very circuitous route to get that started.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if there's a concrete recommendation for the federal government around building innovation into their adjudication process, that it's, to not lock these checklists down, scoring sheets, so firmly that you squeeze out the capacity. There's got to be some way of doing that. I do have one more question. Is that okay?
Please.
Okay. Ms. Sukumar, I heard you say to talk about the digital platform that would get rid of duplication. And I just want to say I loved your presentation. I agree with 99% of what you said. I'm not being argumentative. But in my experience, when outside people look at duplication, they may see duplication where actually in a very nuanced way there is no duplication, that there might be a cultural construct of one service coming from this way, and it's kind of the same service as this one, but they're actually very different.
Right.
So how would this digital platform not squeeze out the little guy who is doing things very differently.
You make a very good point, and it's what I've presented is somewhat simplistic. The idea is for greater transparency, so we know what programming is out there. At the moment, we're completely unaware if someone else is doing what we are proposing, you know?
Yeah.
And so there's risk of duplication. But you're absolutely right. There may be a very nuanced approach to what someone else is doing
Okay,
in a local community.
thank you.
Senator Martin,
Chair.
you're welcome.
I just have a couple of questions. First of all, thank you so much for your presentations and your good work. Ms. Sukumar, I was, one of the recommendations that struck me is under conditions to support innovation, where you say all program funding that nonprofits receive from all levels of government have a dedicated line for investment in R&D and innovation. We talk about how important it is to innovate. So I see how this would be very important. But I'm just wondering, you know, if you're allowed 10 to 15% for administrative purposes, what is a reasonable number for this line if this were to be included? And in terms of the mandate to demonstrate improvement in program delivery year over year, you talk about how it took about 10 years to get to a place. So I could see how you could put in that line, but it would take some time. So I was just wondering how you see this being effectively applied.
So in our organization, we probably have a $2 million payroll budget, and we have one person dedicated to social innovation. In fact, she's here today, and she helped write the presentation, Eliana, sitting in the back. So it's a very small percentage of the overall payroll budget, and yet she has the time and the space to just dedicate herself to that and to come up with the ideas and the community engagement pieces that we're looking for. So, for example, we run hackathons and we get all members of the community involved in order to address language access issues. So we have a better idea of the kind of programming that we want to engage in, rather than blindly go based on our own instinct or intuition as to what's needed out there. So does that answer your question?
You know, I was
And
just thinking for a larger organization, you
Right.
may be able to dedicate certain funds and to do
So-
this, but for
Right. No, but what I'm thinking about in terms of a percentage is it depends on the grant and, you know, obviously it depends on the organization, but it just takes one head count,
right, so but to include that line.
you know,
Okay.
to do it.
Thank you. And I have a question for Mr. Fukunaga. No, is that correct? Okay. So organizations that provide settlement services or other services and programs that are a little bit more, I mean, there's quite a few organizations across the country, and you do some amazing work. And I know in BC there's quite a few as well. But if for organizations that have a real niche market and a very specialized service and programs, do you think that it's harder to attain government funding, or is it similar to what other organizations face if they're competing with a whole lot of other groups? But in your case, are there a lot of organizations competing for the same funding? And are you also really having to search for programs that you can apply to? I'm just curious about the more specific or niche area that you're serving, whether it makes it more difficult or equally difficult. What are some of the barriers that you have faced?
It does make it a little bit more difficult because with specifically what we're trying to do, we're hitting a bunch of different issues that challenge the communities we're trying to help. And when we do try to apply for funds, we're not sure what aspect of our organization to kind of really put at the forefront. Should we say we are an environmental organization because we're dealing with the problem of electronic waste? Or should we say we're an educational organization because we're dealing with teaching people about digital literacy and like 21st century skills? or should we be an employment agency because we're actually hiring people who face barriers? And then we could even fit into a tech startup one. And so it does sometimes become a challenge, especially when it's one person trying to do a lot of the administrative aspects of it, to say, okay, what part of our organization are we going to highlight with this grant or that grant, and are we doing enough in that area to really meet the criteria for the funds? So we're trying to think innovatively and solve a bunch of different issues, but we're not maybe we're not going as deeply, or because we lack the resources to do some of the development to kind of and network with people to get the resources to show what we're doing. It can become a challenge to kind of like highlight like all the good works we're doing. And so, yeah, yeah.
So you just have to search and be creative and
We have a like. I want to take a moment. We have a lot of volunteers who are working, and having the webcast allows them to watch it. So they're all watching right now. Hi guys. And that's how we do it. We really try to reach out to the community because we do something around free and open source software, which has a backbone of collaborative culture. We are able to reach out to a lot of organizations that are in similar boats to us. So other e-waste organizations and stuff like that, like the other free geeks who are that are a part of the network. We reach out to each other and share resources, and that's how we kind of build out that way. So we're looking for non-traditional means of increasing our capacity, so that when we go to government, we can say, "Here's what we're doing. This is the best we can show you what we're doing in the best way possible."
so on that note, just one last question, Chair.
I want to see if Mr. Van Chandel
Okay.
had a comment.
Oui, ben écoutez,
Yes. A few things. Someone earlier said that social innovation is a process on its own, and it's learning by doing, in essence. You learn by doing, and you find solutions along the way. And what matters is to support those who are seeking solutions. Someone earlier asked a question saying that there are a lot of organizations that don't have a charitable organization number, and that is a fact, because the criteria that were valid when the law was first passed have changed. So we should broaden and facilitate the access to these identification numbers for charitable organizations. I would also say the following. Someone asked if the federal government might stimulate innovation. I would remind you that a year and a half ago, the federal government set up a steering group responsible for social innovation and social building strategy, and it tabled its report last summer. And we're still waiting to see if there will be a federal strategy flowing from that work. And this would be a way of granting support for social innovation throughout Canada based on this report. It's Social Development Canada that was responsible for this, and the last speaker just talked about a culture of cooperation. That's fundamental. It's the very basis for the organizations I work with. I work for several organizations, not just the Réseau Québécois d'Innovation Sociale. We try to not duplicate our efforts. There are many of us, and we try to work hand in hand, pooling together our resources, because we can't afford to err, to make a mistake. We have to be very effective. And this bringing together, this pooling together, this transfer of knowledge and expertise amongst us is very important. And as a matter of fact, it should be supported on its own. The idea is not simply to have thousands of organizations, each one of them working on its own. They can even be in competition with each other. The idea is rather to enhance mergers. We've lost the sound momentarily. Anyway, that's the essence of my message. Thank you very much, Mr. Van Schendel.
comment that maybe our witnesses may or may not be aware of. The federal government has announced the launch of a social innovation strategy and committed $755 million to it. And I'm certainly hoping that some of your needs will be met through that institution when it is launched. Right now, it's still in the conceptualization stage. So,
Very good point to end on. So thank you very much. Mr. Van Chantal, sorry.
Oui, excusez-moi, parce qu'en fait,
Yes, forgive me. It was a $755 million fund with an extra $50 million for social funding. But there was also another element in this report on social innovation that has not seen any follow-up. So there were two aspects. There are a lot of people throughout the country who are delighted with this fund, but there is that other element, and it's to support differently social innovation initiatives.
Colleagues, we'd like to thank the witnesses for being here this evening. You've added a lot to our study, and we do appreciate it. Colleagues, it's been a long day. We've had a good a good session, and I want to thank Senator Leprechaun Benson and Senator Duncan for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and you're welcome back at any time. And we appreciated your contribution to the discussion. Colleagues, we stand adjourned.